morning, everyone, and thank you for your patience. And we're starting a little bit later than we had originally intended. The purpose of this press conference today is to release the identity of the deceased and of the officers who were involved in yesterday's shooting that occurred in the 1000 block of Macon Highway, and also to review portions of the body-worn camera video from that incident that will be released to the public. The deceased has been identified as Aaron Hong, who is a 23-year-old Asian male, Athens resident. 2 officers were involved in yesterday's shooting. The first officer was Officer David Harrison. He has been with the Athens Clark County Police Department for 7 years. The second officer is Officer Charles Bittinger. He is still in his first year with the Athens Clark County Police Department. At this point, I want to pause for a minute. I think it's certainly appropriate to offer my condolences to the family members and friends of Aaron Hong. Certainly, this must be a difficult time for them, and I want to ask everyone to please keep that family in your thoughts and prayers. Likewise, I'd like to acknowledge my officers who were involved in yesterday's incident. This is a very difficult and emotional time for those officers as well, having been forced to take the life of another human being. Certainly, they too deserve your thoughts and prayers. So what I'd like to do next is I want to quickly go over the facts of what we knew about yesterday's incident. Following that, I'll review, I'll share the body-worn camera video and discuss that video. And then I'll take time to answer a few questions. Please bear in mind that this is an active, ongoing investigation, and also this is an investigation that we have turned over to the Georgia Bureau of Investigations. Anytime we're involved in a shooting, we want to bring in an independent investigator. So this is a Georgia Bureau of Investigations case. So I'll be limited as far as how much information I'll be able to share. I'll try to answer a few questions, but I will be limited. So let's talk about the facts. On yesterday, July 1st, shortly before 12:30 p.m., officers responded to the 1000 block of Macon Highway for a report of an Asian male with a knife who was covered in blood and who was acting erratically. Upon arrival, officers encountered a person who was later identified as Aaron Hong. At that time, he was in fact bleeding, and he did still have in his possession the knife. Officers immediately ordered Mr. Hong to drop the knife. However, Mr. Hong ignored those directions and began to advance toward the officers with the knife in hand. While backing away from the armed and advancing subject, officers continued to order and at times even plead with him to drop the knife. However, Mr. Hong continued to advance toward the officers with the knife in his hand, and while the officers were pointing guns at him, could be heard yelling numerous times, "Do it." At one point, Officer Bittinger holstered his firearm and was in the process of transitioning to a less lethal taser force option. While Officer Bittinger was transitioning, Mr. Hong suddenly and unexpectedly turned and began running directly toward Officer Harrison while wielding the knife in a threatening manner. Officer Harrison, fearing for his life, shot Mr. Hong several times. Mr. Hong dropped the knife and fell to the ground momentarily. However, as officers approached to secure him, Mr. Hong quickly got back to his feet and began walking towards Officer Bittinger. As he approached Officer Bittinger, Mr. Hong could be heard saying, "Shoot me." At this point, with the knife on the ground and with Mr. Hong no longer appearing to be armed, Officer Bittinger elected to put his firearm away and transition again to the taser. However, Mr. Hong again quickly ran away from Officer Bittinger and directly toward Officer Harrison. Mr. Hong was able to close the distance between him and Officer Harrison very quickly, and before Officer Bittinger could use the taser to stop him. Mr. Hong grabbed Officer Harrison and a struggle ensued. During that struggle, Mr. Hong was able to get behind the officer and grabbed Officer Harrison around the shoulder area with his left arm around his shoulders. Officer Harrison had been in the process of holstering his firearm just as Mr. Hong charged at him. So he still had his hand on the firearm with it being placed into his holster as he was charged by Mr. Hong. Mr. Hong immediately was able to maneuver to his backside, and while he had his left arm around his shoulder area, reached down with his right hand and grabbed Officer Harrison's firearm and attempted to take it out of the holster. So at this point, Officer Harrison and Mr. Hong were struggling for possession of Officer Harrison's firearm. At this point, Officer Bittinger feared that Officer Hong would get Officer Harrison's firearm and use it to kill or seriously injure either Harrison or him. To prevent this from happening, Officer Bittinger shot Mr. Hong several times. Following the shots, both Mr. Hong and Officer Harrison fell to the ground. Fire and emergency medical services personnel who were already on scene rendered first aid to Mr. Hong. Unfortunately, he succumbed to his injuries and he was pronounced dead at the scene. So those are the facts as we know them. Again, we immediately contacted the Georgia Bureau of Investigations and asked that they respond to investigate the incident. They were there shortly thereafter and took charge of the entire incident. Also, in accordance with our departmental policy, both officers have been placed on administrative leave pending the preliminary review of the facts in this case. So those are the facts. What I'd like to do at this point is I'd like to take a few minutes and go through the body-worn camera video. There are two, and we'll begin with the body-worn video camera footage from Officer Bittinger's body-worn camera.
Awesome to put you up now. Just a second.
Bittinger is in the passenger seat, Harrison is driving. Okay, now they're on scene. You see the person in the yellow. This is Mr. Hong standing right in front of him in the yellow. A couple of things I want you to take note of. As soon as they get out of the car, they're going to say multiple times, "Drop the knife," and start telling them to drop the knife. And you'll see them, Mr. Hong, start advancing towards them. They're going to back away from him, and as they're backing away, you will also hear Mr. Hong making statements to the effect of "do it," while they're pointing the guns at him as if he's, inferring to shoot him.
Put the knife down! Put the knife down! Put it down! I've got one at gunpoint central. Put the knife down! Put it down! He's not complying to command central. He's coming at us with a knife. Knife down! Knife down! Put the knife down, sir, please. Put the knife down. Put it down, man, please. We can help you, please. Put it down. Put the knife down. Put it down. No, no. No. No, please don't. Do it. Please don't. Do it. No. Do it. Central, we need units here, 1018.
Okay, so they've been backing down, they backed away quite a distance. What you're gonna hear now is Officer Harrison is going to, talk to Bittinger and tell him less lethal. What he's telling him to do there is, deploy his taser. And unfortunately, what you will see is as soon as, while he's making that transition to the taser, and before he can get, in a position to do that, Mr. Harn quickly and unexpectedly charges at the officer.
Put it down!
He said less lethal. Federal and state law, as well as Athens, Clarke County Police Department policy and procedure prohibits law enforcement officers from using deadly force except in cases where the actions of another pose a clear and imminent threat of serious injury or death to the officer or to another individual. Although a separate and independent investigation by the Georgia Bureau of Investigations is underway and still has to be completed, and we will have to wait for the final review and a decision from the Athens Clarke County District Attorney. The body-worn camera video evidence that I have seen and that I have shared with you today suggests that the officers reasonably feared for their lives and for their safety and used deadly force to defend themselves. Again, we'll have to await the final decision by the district attorney. At this point, I'll take a few questions.
Chief, can you talk about Officer Bittinger? I understand you said he's been on the force for a year. Correct me if I'm wrong, he was involved in the officer-involved shooting in March as well. Can you talk about what clearance he went through to return to active duty before this incident yesterday?
Absolutely, we always, first off, we send all of those officers back through firearms training, psychological evaluation training, a battery of examinations to make sure that they are in fact cleared and able to resume full duty.
Can you talk as the chief of the department here? I know it comes with the job, but he's been on the force for a year and been involved in 2 officer-involved shootings. Can you comment on that and possibly just his role as an officer, what that might do to him being in that role?
I think, with this job, you know that dangers will be there. No one wants to take a life of an individual, and certainly he's, not feeling, he's concerned and upset that it happened twice in such a short time period, but I think you saw what he was confronted with, and, I know the Georgia Bureau of Investigations and the district attorney will have to render their own decisions about it, but I think he's comfortable with the decisions that he's made. Obviously, we're prepared to offer him any assistance that he may need to make sure that he's able to get through this, and like I said early on, oftentimes we're concentrated and focusing on the family, and certainly you want to do that, but you also have to remember that an officer involved in a situation like that, it's going to take an impact on them stress-wise, emotionally, and we have to look out for his well-being as well.
Chief, why did you release this video so quickly?
I think it's important to, be transparent. I think that was one of my promises when I came as the police chief here in Athens, Clarke County, was that I was going to be transparent and share the information about what is occurring, as well as body-worn camera footage. Also, I think, this is a unique time frame for the Athens, Clarke County Police Department and, the county in general, in that we've had 3 officer-involved shootings in a relatively short period of time. And so I want people to be able to see exactly what the officers were confronting to make their own decisions about how they feel about what occurred. We never want to take another person's life. We just absolutely don't. And I really wanted people to see what our officers were doing to try to prevent having to take the steps that they did. At points you can hear in their voices them pleading for men to put the gun down, and we don't want to do this, and we can help you, because this is the last thing that we want to do as a police department as a police officer, and so all too often, all across the nation, we get an image that, you know, we just go out and shoot people and it's part of a day's work. It's not part of a day's work. Our greatest value is the preservation of human life, and so I think it's important for us to get out early, show you exactly what happened, and you be the judge of it. So that's why we released the video.
In your view, were your officers professional? You said you believe they're justified. Were they professional out there?
I don't want to do anything that would, not allow the district attorney to do a thorough, investigation of the case. I'll leave it up to you. You be the judge of what you saw, and that's why I wanted to show it to you. I know I have my own opinion, but that's my opinion. It doesn't really count. What counts is the GBI's investigation and what the district attorney has to say at the end of the day.
Can you talk about what Hong was doing before officers arrived? Was he just kind of walking around with that knife? I know you guys were called there, but what was he?
There was a number of things that he was doing in the area that drew the public's attention to him. Beyond the fact that he was there, he was bleeding, he had a knife, and he was acting erratically. I don't want to get into that. I want to give the Georgia Bureau of Investigations the opportunity to do their investigation, and more facts will come out at a later point, but I'd like to leave those questions to them.
Chief, when something like this happens, there are a lot of questions. Do you think this underscores why it's important for officers to have those cameras worn on their bodies?
I think absolutely. I think first, research and studies have shown that the presence of a body-worn camera will reduce the number of citizen complaints and reduce the number of use of force complaints, whether it be that the officer knows the camera's running and is going to behave differently, or that the public knows that the camera's going to behave differently. It doesn't matter as long as we are getting the results that we want. So absolutely, it underscores the importance of the body-worn camera footage. And it also allows the public to see the very difficult and tenuous type situations, very dangerous type situations our officers are confronting on a regular basis as they go about doing their difficult job.
Do you know if Mr. Hong lived at that apartment complex?
We have information that he may have subleased there, but that information is still being investigated.
Have investigators learned anything about what it might have led to yesterday? Do we know mental health issues, drugs, personal life? Was there anything in his life that might have caused yesterday?
Again, that's part of the GBI's investigation, and I don't want to expound on that.
Chief, you mentioned 3 officer-involved shootings in recent times.
Mhm.
The one in March, you talked about that. What was the other one?
Second one was in April. It was Easter weekend, and the officer involved was Officer Marsden. Gentleman came out with a shotgun and confronted him with a shotgun. And our officer used lethal force.
And he was cleared of that.
Marsden was cleared, yes.
So far, 2 of those incidents, they've been cleared, all the officers involved.
That's correct.
By GBI and DA's office?
That's, well, by GBI, they've been cleared, but the district attorney continues to, they'll take up to a year or longer to put out their final findings in the case.
And just to confirm, from yesterday, I believe, you said at that time you believed that the blood on Mr. Hung was his own blood. Does that remain today?
He was bleeding when the officers arrived. There was blood there prior to the officers arriving that, is most likely his blood.
And just to confirm, he was struck that first time before getting back up. Was he struck by the bullets? I know you said they fired.
I think it's obvious that
Okay.
he was struck, yes.
Okay. And then can you kind of go through, I know you talked about the tasing, at what point they tried to tase before it was too late.
Again, so our officers are trained that if a person is armed, either with a knife or a gun, you have to have a lethal response, and then you can incorporate a less lethal response when time and circumstances allow for it, provided that it's not going to unduly jeopardize their safety. In this instance, as soon as they came on to this person, he began walking towards them, and at points he was actually picking up the pace and coming towards them, and they were backing away. They got to a point where they were about to go out into the highway or go into they came out of the front of that apartment complex and were going into the highway, and at that point, I think that was a good point at which they were going to try to deploy deployed a taser. Unfortunately, and you can actually, if you look at the video later on, I've watched it a number of times, you can hear him holstering and you can actually see him coming up with the taser. And as soon as that happens, Mr. Hong turns and starts running in the other direction. So the officers were prepared to deploy the taser at the first opportunity that afforded itself, but Mr. Hong's actions did not allow that to occur. And again, when he got up off the ground, at that point, he starts walking towards Bittinger. Bittinger initially had his gun out, but since Mr. Hong no longer had the knife, don't know that he would have been appropriate in shooting at that point. So he's transitioning to his taser. He actually got the taser out and was trying to get it on target, but again, he ran toward the other officer. That didn't allow him to get the taser off. I'll take one more question. Yes, sir.
Chief, I believe you said there were 3 officers who responded to this incident yesterday. What was the 3rd officer doing during this time period?
So there were multiple officers that responded to the incident. 3 of them were actually on scene when the shooting took place. The 3rd officer had just arrived and was actually getting out of his car. If you look at the end of one of the videos, you can see him actually walk up, but he really wasn't involved except for he got there just as the shooting was taking place.
And real quick, I'm sorry, was the mental health team called in for this incident?
Sir, this incident, it seems like a lifetime, but I think it's probably 3 minutes from start to finish. And so we didn't have an opportunity to think about getting the mental health team on scene. There's all kind of other resources that we would have liked to bring to bear. We have ballistic shields, we have the mental health team, we have other officers who are trained in advanced crisis intervention. However, the facts and circumstances in this case didn't lend themselves to allow for us to get those resources on scene. Thank you very much.